A lone cowboy stood frozen as 70 Apache warriors slowly closed in around him, their shadows stretching across the dry land like a silent warning that he felt the cold fear tighten in his chest, because he knew running was impossible and fighting would mean certain death. Beside him stood his only horse, the one thing that had kept him alive through hunger, storms, and endless lonely nights. The wind carried the sound of heavy breathing, metal, and quiet footsteps, making every second feel heavier. Then the last. The cowboy noticed something strange in their eyes. Not rage, not hunger for blood, but urgency and pain. His heart pounded when he saw a wounded Apache woman barely holding on to life, her blood dark against the dust. In that moment, he understood the cruel truth. This was not just a standoff. This was a test that he had one horse, one chance, and one impossible decision that would change his fate forever. The story follows a poor cowboy who lived far from town where no roads reached and no voices answered back. He spent his days working the dry land and his nights staring at the stars, knowing loneliness was his only neighbor. His only true companion was his horse, a loyal animal that carried him through hunger, cold nights, and endless miles of silence. That horse was not just transport. It was survival, hope, and family to him. The cowboy owned nothing else of value, yet he protected that small life with everything he had. Every evening looked the same until one night felt different. The wind stopped. The animals went quiet. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Without warning, the silence broke and fear slowly entered his heart. He sensed danger before he saw it, a heavy feeling that told him his simple life was about to change forever. This quiet cowboy had no idea that before the night ended, he would face a choice that would test his humanity and rewrite his destiny. The feeling in his chest grew heavier as distant movements slowly became clear on the edge of his land, and before he could reach for his rifle, the figures were already there, emerging from the dust like shadows, turning solid one by one until the ground around him was no longer empty, but surrounded by 70 Apache warriors who had appeared without a single warning sound. And yet no arrows were drawn, no guns were lifted, and no war cry shattered the air, which made the moment far more terrifying than open violence, because silence carried intention and intention carried power. The cowboy stood still, knowing any sudden move could turn the land red, and his breath became shallow as he counted them, without meaning to realizing escape was no longer an option, and that this was not a robbery or a raid like the stories he had heard in town, because these men did not look hungry for blood. They looked focused, driven by something deeper and more urgent, their eyes sharp, but controlled, their stance calm, but commanding. And as the circle tightened just enough to remind him of his place, he noticed their leader step forward with slow, deliberate steps, and still no weapon was raised, which made his heart pound harder than if blades had been pointed at his chest, because mercy was never guaranteed and confusion was dangerous. Then he saw it, the reason none of them attacked, the reason fear hung heavy instead of violence. Lying just behind the leader was a wounded Apache woman, barely conscious, her body supported by two warriors, her face pale, her breath uneven, and blood staining the earth beneath her. And in that instant, the cowboy understood why the land had gone silent earlier, why the animals had fled, and why fate had led these men to his door. Because this was not a threat, but a desperate moment. The warriors parted slightly, allowing him to see her clearly, and her eyes opened for a second, filled with pain and exhaustion, before closing again. And the cowboy felt something break inside him, because he had seen suffering before, but never this close, never carried by enemies who now waited for his response, without words, without demands, without force, just expectation pressing down on him harder than any weapon ever could. And as the wind returned, softly brushing the dust around their feet, he realized this was the moment his simple life had been moving toward all along, the moment that would decide whether he remained just a poor, lonely man forgotten by the world, or became something else entirely, because 70 warriors were watching, not to judge his strength, but his heart. And the land itself seemed to wait for his answer as time stretched thin, and every choice disappeared except one that would cost him everything he owned and give him nothing in return except the weight of knowing that whatever he did next would echo far beyond this night and long after the dust settled. His eyes stayed on her as the warriors carefully lowered her onto the ground, and the moment her body touched the dust, a weak sound escaped her lips, making his stomach tighten, because it was not a cry of anger, but one of pain and fading strength. Her breathing came in broken pulls, each one slower than the last, and blood soaked through the cloth pressed against her side, dark and heavy, as if the land itself was drinking her life away. The cowboy took a step forward without thinking, then stopped, unsure if he was allowed to cross that invisible line. Yet no one stopped him, and that silence spoke louder than words. The warriors stood tall and strong, men who had faced battles, storms, and death without fear, but now their power meant nothing because none of it could stop the slow loss of blood stealing her future. Right in front of them, her hands trembled as she tried to move, but her legs failed, her body refusing to obey. And when her eyes opened again, they searched the faces around her not with hatred, but with trust that cut deeper than any blade. The cowboy noticed how one warrior knelt beside her, brushing dust from her hair with care, showing she was more than a fighter, she was family. She was life, and she mattered more than pride or tradition. The air felt tight, as if every breath depended on what happened next, and the cowboy felt his heart pull toward her, because pain looked the same in every human, no matter the side, no matter the past. He could see fear hiding behind her strength, and he understood that without help she would not see another sunrise. The warriors exchanged quiet looks, their faces controlled, but their eyes heavy with urgency. They had crossed land after land, carrying her, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help, and now they stood before a man who owned almost nothing, yet held the one thing that could save her time to reach safety, time to reach healing, time she no longer had. The cowboy swallowed hard, realizing this was not about courage or fear, but about choice and cost, because strength meant nothing here, only sacrifice mattered. The woman tried to speak, but only a faint breath came out, and one warrior gently placed his hand over hers as if promising she was not alone, and that simple act broke the last wall inside the cowboy. He felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest, because these powerful men who could take whatever they wanted had chosen not to. They had chosen hope instead, and now hope rested on his shoulders alone. The wind carried the smell of blood and dust and fate, and the land stood still waiting, because this wounded woman could not walk, could not ride without help, and could not survive unless someone gave up something precious right now. And the cowboy knew, without anyone saying a word, that the decision standing before him would define who he truly was when everything else was stripped away. The truth settled into his mind with painful clarity as he looked from the woman to his horse and felt the distance between them stretch like a final line he could not step away from, because he knew what the horse meant to him and what losing it would do to his future, since without it he would be stranded, unable to hunt, unable to travel, unable to trade, and likely unable to survive the coming seasons. Yet as heavy as that fear was, it could not silence the other truth rising inside him, that if he turned away now, the woman would not live to see the morning light, because her body was already failing and time was moving faster than mercy ever could. His hands clenched at his sides as memories flashed through his thoughts of cold nights warmed only by that horse, of long rides across empty land, of trust built through years of shared struggle. And he realized that animal was not property, but life itself. Yet when he looked back at the woman, he saw another life slipping away, and the weight of that knowledge pressed on him harder than hunger ever had. The warriors remained still, giving him space that felt endless and unforgiving, because they were not forcing him, and that made the choice crueler than any threat ever could. His breath slowed as he understood that keeping the horse meant choosing himself, while giving it meant stepping into a future filled with loss, uncertainty, and danger. He imagined waking the next day alone, watching the dust trail fade as they rode away, and felt a sharp ache in his chest, knowing survival would become a daily fight. Yet he also imagined the woman's breath stopping before sunrise, and that image burned deeper than fear, because it was final and could never be undone. The land around him seemed to listen, as if even the wind waited for his decision, and he felt small yet powerful at the same time, because for once his choice mattered beyond his own life. His eyes moved again to the horse, calm and unaware, trusting him completely, and that trust cut through him because it reminded him of the man he wanted to be rather than the one fear would shape. The woman stirred weakly, and a soft sound escaped her lips, barely more than air, but it carried enough meaning to break his hesitation, because it was not a plea, it was surrender, and he realized that refusing would not make him safer. It would only make him live with something heavier than loss. He straightened slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into resolve, and though his heart pounded, his mind grew clear, because the choice was no longer about survival alone, But about what kind of story his life would leave behind, he knew the path ahead would be harsh, lonely, and uncertain, yet he also knew that some moments demand more than sense or safety, and as the night deepened around them, he accepted that giving up his horse might end the life he knew, but saving hers would give meaning to everything he had endured until now. And in that silent space, between fear and courage, the impossible choice became the only one he could live with. His hands trembled as he reached for the reins, and the leather felt heavier than ever before, as if it carried every memory he had built with the horse. And when he led the animal forward, the night seemed to lean closer, watching the moment unfold. His breath caught as he placed a steady palm against the horse's neck, feeling warmth and trust pulse beneath the skin, and for a brief second doubt tried to pull him back, but he pushed through it because hesitation would steal time. The woman did not have. He nodded once to the nearest warrior, and together they moved carefully, lifting her fragile body with slow respect. And when her weight settled onto the saddle, the cowboy adjusted the straps with practiced care, even though his vision blurred, because this was the same motion he had performed countless times for himself. Yet now each pull felt like a goodbye. The horse shifted softly, sensing change, but did not resist. And that quiet obedience broke something deep inside him as he steadied the woman's form, making sure she would not fall. Her breath brushed his sleeve, faint and warm, and when her eyes opened, they met his for a heartbeat filled with gratitude and disbelief. And that look carried more weight than gold ever could. The warriors watched without sound, their faces unreadable, yet their focus sharp, as if they were measuring the truth of his choice rather than the act itself. The cowboy stepped back, slowly releasing the reins, and the distance between his hand and the horse widened into a space that felt endless. He realized then that everything he owned, every future plan, every chance at ease, rode away from him in that moment. Yet instead of regret, he felt a strange calm settle over his chest, because the decision had been made. With his whole heart, the leader approached and placed a steady hand on the horse, guiding it gently, while another warrior secured the woman's balance. And still no words were spoken, because words were too small for what had happened. The cowboy stood alone in the dust, watching the scene complete itself, knowing there was no turning back, and that the land he had depended on would now test him harder than ever before. The horse lifted its head and let out a soft breath, as if marking the moment, and the sound echoed through him like a final promise kept. The warriors formed a protective line around the woman, and for the first time since their arrival, the tension shifted into something else, something close to respect. And the cowboy felt their eyes on him, not as a weak man who could be taken from, but as someone who had given freely when he had every reason not to. The wind moved again, brushing past his face, carrying the scent of dust, leather, and change. And as the night deepened, he stood with empty hands, yet a full heart, understanding that he had lost everything that kept him alive, but had gained something far rarer, something no fear could ever take away. The leader stepped closer with calm authority, and the space between them felt different now, no longer heavy with danger, but charged with meaning. As he raised one hand slowly, and in response the warriors eased their grip and lowered their weapons in a smooth, silent motion that changed the air completely. And the cowboy felt his pulse slow as he realized no harm would come, because something unseen had shifted. The leader's eyes met his, steady and deep, carrying respect earned, not demanded, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture simple yet powerful that spoke louder than any promise. The circle opened wider, allowing space to breathe, and the woman was adjusted with careful hands, as if every movement honored the choice that had been made. The cowboy stood still, unsure of what came next, yet feeling seen in a way he never had before, as the leader took another step forward and placed his palm over his own chest, then extended it toward the cowboy, not as a threat, but as acknowledgement. And that single act carried the weight of an oath. The warriors followed suit, lowering their gazes briefly, then straightening with a new purpose that replaced tension with resolve, and the night seemed to soften around them, as if the land itself accepted what had occurred. The cowboy sensed that this moment would be remembered, not because of force, but because restraint had been chosen, and that realization filled him with a quiet strength he did not know he possessed. The leader spoke at last in a low, steady voice, measured and respectful, and though the words were unfamiliar, the meaning was clear. Gratitude, honor, and protection woven together in tone and posture. The woman stirred, and a faint calm touched her face, as if she felt the safety settle in, and the warriors formed around her with renewed focus, not guarding against an enemy, but safeguarding a life. The cowboy's chest tightened, as understanding dawned that his sacrifice had reshaped the path ahead for all of them, and that fear had been replaced by something far rarer: trust. The leader gestured toward the open land beyond the ranch, then back toward the cowboy, drawing an invisible line of promise that needed no translation. And in that silent exchange, a bond formed stronger than fear or history. The wind carried away the last edge of threat and left behind a stillness filled with respect, and the cowboy realized he was no longer alone in the world because his choice had echoed outward and returned to him. Transformed. The warriors mounted and prepared to move with care and purpose, and before they turned, the leader looked back once more, holding the cowboy's gaze with a nod that sealed the moment. And as they began to depart, the night felt lighter, and the cowboy stood rooted not in fear, but in awe, knowing that violence had been expected, yet honor had arrived instead, and that in a single unplanned moment respect had replaced threat, changing everything that would come after. As the warriors disappeared into the darkness, the sound of their movement slowly faded, leaving the cowboy standing alone under the open sky. Yet nothing felt the same anymore, because the silence no longer felt empty, it felt protected. Days turned into weeks, and something strange happened. No one crossed his land with harm in their heart. Travelers passed safely, animals were never stolen, and danger never returned, because unseen eyes now watched over him. The cowboy struggled through hardship without his horse, yet he never once regretted his choice, because every sunrise reminded him that a life had been saved and a bond had been formed. His kindness had turned fear into respect and enemies into guardians, and though he remained poor, he carried a quiet honor richer than gold. The land that once tested him now stood with him, and his name traveled farther than he ever could. The story ends with a truth that stayed etched into the dust and the hearts of those who heard it: real power is not taken by force, it is earned through sacrifice, and one selfless act can change a destiny forever.